We'll go directly to Paula then. Give directly to Paula, please, and then we can take the questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Victoria. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present on another topic that was discussed quite extensively in the 2019 I&I programme, and that was around the concept of coupling models across different sectors and scales. And we discussed this as one particular way that would help to deal with the complexity of landscape systems through the way that a lot of people work with individual models that capture processes in specific components of landscape systems. So can coupling those models together help us to capture some of those interactions or trade-offs and synergies between those different components of landscapes in a more systemic manner? So we had lots and lots of interesting presentations and discussions around this topic in both the opening and the closing workshops and throughout the whole programme, particularly around when it's useful to couple models and when is it necessary or not necessary to couple models. How can we get a better understanding of the benefits of model coupling, and particularly what are the challenges, the methodological challenges around model coupling, and how can we devise a research agenda that starts to overcome some of those challenges. And that's what I'm going to try and present in this presentation. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background and a couple of quick examples that I'll try to go through very quickly given the time. And then I'll focus on basically the research roadmap that emerged at the end of the 2019 programme on this topic. So hang on, things are not moving. Oh, hang on, now I'm probably moving too quick. Okay, thanks. So, so starting off with, so why would we want to couple models together in the first place? And lots of discussions around this. So I've simplified it incredibly into two very broad topics around capturing cross-scale interactions. And this can be important because if you're making a landscape decision in an area of the UK, this is most likely to be affected by global drivers. So for example, if you're a farmer somewhere in the UK, you will do things on your land that fit around international trade policy. So what will you grow on your land to sell domestically, and what would you grow as exports? And there can be many other global drivers that affect landscapes, such as migration, international tourism, the UK's different commitments to international policy. There are also interesting cross-scale effects related to local implementation of national policies and how do landowners implement some of those policies, which can be in very different ways depending on the characteristics of those landowners and what they're trying to achieve. And of course, whatever decisions we make at whatever level, whether that's a landowner, a land user, or a policy decision maker, those can have implications for other areas outside of that decision maker's realm, particularly for areas outside of the UK and other parts of the world. If some of the UK policy is attempting to meet our own national commitments and having potentially unintended consequences of exporting our environmental footprint to other countries in the world. And then the other aspect is cross-sector interactions. And here, again, this is quite obvious that different sectors interact. So, for example, agriculture and urban areas often compete for land. They'll also compete for other resources, such as water use with other sectors. And basically how those lands are used and managed will have consequences for other sectors, such as biodiversity. And if decision makers make their decisions basically on an understanding of a single sector in isolation, there is then a potential for unintended consequences of those decisions on other sectors. So just to provide some illustrative examples, first on cross-coupling models across scale. This is an example from the FABLE Consortium, the Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use and Energy Pathways Consortium. This is a global consortium that consists of, now currently in 2020, 20 country teams who are working together using quite simplified integrated models to try and transition towards sustainable land and food systems. Those modelling teams are trying to develop their own national pathways to get sustainable land use within their own countries, but at the same time they take account of different synergies between agriculture, water, biodiversity, healthy diets and greenhouse gas emissions within their integrated model. And each of those national pathways is integrated together through what we call a Fable linker tool. And this allows us to look collectively whether each of the pathways within the country meets global targets, such as those that are consistent with the Paris Agreement or with the SDGs, and to look at sort of the consequences for global trade from individual countries' pathways. And this goes through a skenathon process, which is basically an iterative cycle where we look at inconsistencies both in trade and in ambition in meeting those global targets. And over several iterations, we get closer and closer to meeting the global targets and understanding the interactions between different countries in terms of trade and collectively meeting those targets. Very briefly, in 2019, we looked at 5 global targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from crops and livestock. That's consistent with the Paris Agreement, keeping temperatures below 1.5. Global greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, zero net deforestation, trying to meet zero hunger, and trying to get 50% of the Earth's terrestrial land supporting biodiversity conservation. And what we found from that work is that collectively, after 5 iterations of the skenathon, we were able to meet 4 of those targets, but still failed quite a lot on the greenhouse gas emissions from crops and livestock. We're now going through a similar process in 2020, where we're getting much closer to these targets and able to extend our ambition as we're starting to understand the interactions. And what this has helped is that each national country works closely with its stakeholders. So in the UK, not only do the stakeholders we work for in the devolved administrations, DEFRA, the Climate Change Committee, for example, start to understand the implications of their own policy ambitions, they start to understand how they interact with those of other countries and how collectively you can or can't meet your global ambitions. This shows implications of our run on UK land use change, and I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but the blue line here shows one of the most dramatic implications for the UK land use of the national pathway, which was a large decrease in pasture land within the UK, which was largely driven by implementation of the government's Eat Well diet, which is a new healthy diet for the UK, and this assumed full implementation of that diet, along with other assumptions from the Climate Change Committee on different improvements in productivity due to innovation, and also slight changes in stocking density as well. If we look at a quick example on coupling models across scales, this is from an EU impressions project where 10 individual models were integrated across 6 sectors. So this looks at urban development, agriculture, forestry, water resources, and fluvial and coastal flooding. And you'll see when we talk about model coupling, we see lots of these diagrams where we have models linked together by arrows, which represent data flows between different modeling environments that represent the interactions. So for example, where people live in urban environments and how urban environments spread through increasing artificial surfaces affects regional hydrology. Where people live also affects who's at risk from flooding. It also affects how much water is needed by that domestic population and the industry that is associated with them. And both urban land use and water use also interact with what's left unavailable for agriculture and for forestry. And they are all restricted again by flooding on how you can use your land. And of course, all of this in terms of our quality and availability of habitat affects biodiversity. So just showing one quick outputs here of the benefits. These 10 models were run independently with the same set of scenario assumptions as running them in a coupled modelling system. And then we looked at the difference between the outcomes in terms of how would you be informing a decision maker of the outcomes on a whole range of different indicators related to agriculture, biodiversity, the urban environment, carbon storage, etc. The key messages here is you get very different system behaviour in a coupled modelling system that takes account of those interactions between sectors compared to an uncoupled modelling system. So all the green squares basically show a greater than 50% difference in the magnitude of the outcomes, and the ones with the double-headed arrows show actually the direction of change in those indicators was the opposite if you run it in a coupled system to if you run it in a decoupled system. So massive differences in how you might inform landscape decisions depending if you couple or not. So in terms of what we discussed in the 2019 programme, this is the photo I took of the board we produced on our research priorities that came out of the breakout group in the closing workshop. As Felix mentioned, we had sort of a short, medium and long-term timescale to those research priorities, and we grouped them into sort of two key methodological groups around a model coupling toolbox and some of the methodological technicalities around model coupling. But also we're very keen to emphasise the importance of transparency, reproducibility and communication, particularly important for coupled models, and to understand much more about the benefits of either coupling or not coupling. So just looking at some of those very, very quickly. If we start to look at some of the methods of modelling coupling, we had lots of discussions about the various pros and cons of different methods, and we have different examples that already exist from direct integration of model codes, such as the Jules modelling system, where we use model wrappers to allow people to continue to code in the language they're familiar with, but again, lots of difficulties in getting model wrappers set up and talking to each other. The use of model emulators to speed up model runs, and then you link the emulator rather than your original model, or actually the use of just linking data cubes themselves, which is just pre-run sets of model outcomes. And ultimately it comes to actually what is the research question or the decision context that you were trying to address, and what are the types of models you're trying to integrate together to work out what methods may or may not be most appropriate. And there were lots of considerations that we discussed in terms of actually, is there a need to do cross-scale or cross-domain model integration, or actually both, to answer that research question or that decision, inform that decision? Is it sufficient to just pass data down your models in one direction, or do you have to have explicit representation of feedbacks for the decision in question? And how speedy does your application to be? Lots of individual models can take a long time to run. Once you link them together, model runtime can very quickly extrapolate, and that is not actually terribly useful for decision makers who want more exploratory systems to explore some of these systemic interactions. So underpinning all of that was the key need that whatever method you use, you really need good model documentation, and that has to be really underlined by good communication between the modelers, and a real recognition that all of this takes a lot of time. Just understanding someone else's model can take a lot of time, and actually explaining your model to somebody else so that you can understand how to link them together takes a lot of time, but can actually be very useful for you in understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your own model. You also need to be able to understand how the whole chain would work together, come to some agreement on all of those underlying model assumptions, and what are the particular details of those data passes, right down to really nailing down definitions and units. And I think what most of us came up with in discussions in the 2019 programme was the learning process of doing all that is just as important actually as the final coupled model, and particularly if that learning process is a participatory process and it involves stakeholders right from the beginning, so they understand and are involved in the assumptions and the documentation and the decisions that are made, and hence more likely to buy into the final coupled model. And then key to all of that in terms of big research priorities are that we need better and more metadata and ontologies to help support the model coupling process. And one way of doing that is we need more collaborative environments, have better ways of working together to help inform how we might integrate integrate both data and model together. We discussed virtual labs as one environment for doing this in, but key to whatever environment was an open access policy towards making both individual model documentation and code more available, as well as the facilities to link those models together. And then in terms of how we might do this, in terms of the methods, we started to talk about a toolbox that would provide the functions that would enable that model coupling to take place a little bit more easy than it is at the minute, where most teams are almost starting from scratch at the beginning of a model coupling exercise. And here again, I have to thank Gordon Blair again for this slide, who he presented in the 2019 programme, where what the Gordon argues is that many model coupling frameworks have these box and arrow diagrams, where you have big boxes for each of the individual models and very thin arrows, whereas actually what we should have is really thick arrows, because this is where all the really important stuff happens. This is where we may need interesting transfer functions. We may need to bring together models across different scales, which might need some downscaling or some aggregation. There is a whole set of functions which is represented by these Lego bricks that go on this linkage between the models that we shouldn't underplay. And what would be interesting would be to be able to move towards a framework that would enable and facilitate that coupling by providing access to a whole range of functions that people could use automatically to start to couple models, and that would enable much more sharing of data and code to facilitate that coupling. And we also discussed here again about the increasing data availability and whether these types of environment could enable more in-depth gestion and analysis of these data sources and potentially move us towards more and better real-time calibration of coupled models. So yeah, finally, again, on the technicalities, again, many of these were touched upon in Felix and Peter's presentation, because they're all around about understanding uncertainty, particularly important in coupled models, because we're not only looking at the structural and other forms of uncertainty in individual models, but we're coupling them together. So it's really important to understand how errors or biases propagate through those modeling chains, whether there are compensating biases or whether they actually extrapolate through that modeling chain. And we had some discussion on about the possibilities. Is it possible to constrain uncertainty in coupled models in a similar way to they use forcing in atmospheric models to try and constrain uncertainty? And then some suggestions again of using decision theory to actually understand where uncertainty is is important to the final decision, so that you can narrow down on exactly where you need to focus in your modeling chain to try and look in more detail. And discussions around Bayesian approaches, and particularly Gaussian process emulators, that would speed up coupled models and allow you to more easily explore a full space of uncertainty and decisions. And so this all led to quite an ambitious outcome in our 5 to 10 year timescale, that basically we ideally would want to get some kind of plug and play modular system that would allow easier and quicker model coupling, and also very importantly decoupling, so that once you've got a set of models coupled together, you can actually pull them apart again, and you can put them together in different configurations to really understand some of the uncertainties around those models and where they can be most useful for informing decisions. What this would also do would allow greater model intercomparisons, which would inform us much more about structural uncertainty. And I've put the figure up is of one of the very few intermodel comparison studies of land use models. And you can see from the very large envelope of uncertainty that it is enormous, and this is an area where we need much more research. And it's an area where other modelling sectors who use land use scenarios take very little notice of that land use models produce very different outcomes, whereas it's much more common to use several climate change models, but not several land use models. So again, I will finish there, and a big thank you to all the participants again, and particularly to those who provided presentations and were involved in the breakout group that developed that research roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula, and also Felix again. Since we don't have much time, and actually we're already over time, just a few brief questions maybe that I had specifically for Paula that were posted on Slido. So there's one question on your slide 5. Nick is asking, what is the other land that replaces pastures? That's like, should be a very quick question to respond.
Okay, yeah, so that's more complicated to give a long answer, but very roughly, we're also modelling the afforestation targets for all of the devolved regions. So it releases land to allow those afforestation targets to be met, but also then that land is released for, in the Fable calculator, what's just referred to as other natural land. And this is where the simple calculator doesn't yet drill into actually what a policymaker would do with that other natural land. Whereas you then would go to your devolved administrations or to DEFRA to sort of discuss some of their policies in terms of their current work, in terms of potentially paying farmers to deliver public goods. That's currently not in the calculator, but that's where you need to bring different modelling approaches together to provide those kind of information.
Thank you very much. And then another question again for you, Paula, is how does one deal with the additional uncertainty associated with error propagation through coupled models and integrated modeling?
Well, I think the most important thing is you have to be really transparent, because you can't just get it. There's no magic method to just make it disappear. But I think that there have been studies where they've looked at error propagation through coupled models, and it can balloon or it can compensate. So I think it's really important to actually document and analyse and assess where that happens. And again, I think you have to do it with respect to whatever your research question or whatever your decision context, because actually if you understand where the key model or the key linkage, which is causing a lot of that uncertainty to balloon, then that you can focus on that if it's really important for the decision in question. If actually it makes no difference to what a decision maker would do, then actually it's not particularly valuable to spend all your time and effort focusing in on that particular point of uncertainty. So in my mind, it's that bigger picture of being transparent in the communication of that uncertainty, but actually working side by side in a participatory method with your decision maker to understand where it's important to focus the effort.
Okay, and then Carol is asking whether the modeling you presented on agriculture climate targets is published or available in some ways.
Yes, so if that's the Fable one, which I think it was, so it is. There was actually a link, so I don't know if the slides are going to be made available. So there is a link to the Fable website in the presentation slide, but basically it's part of the Food and Land Use Coalition. So if you search for Fable under Food and Land Use Coalition, it will come up. The 2019 report is fully published. We've just in the process of publishing the 2020 report, which will come out probably later this month, but on the same website. Thank
you very much, Paula. I have now actually still quite a couple of questions that I think are more directed to Peter after his presentation, which we're not able to take. But I also would like still to give some chance maybe to attendants to ask any questions they may have to Felix and Paula. So if you have any more, then just raise your hand or write another question into Slido while we're doing this. Peter, so one more question for you is, so Richard Reeve writes, my experience is that if you can't make the result intuitive, then you don't understand it, and decision makers probably shouldn't accept it and use it. So is there anything you would respond to that?
No, probably not. I think there are results that are not intuitive until you run the model, and then they become intuitive as you understand the system better by thinking about it more. So just my point about non-intuitive results are just explaining the problem to the decision maker and expecting them to understand it isn't enough. You probably need the model and to go through in much more detail what's happening. And I don't think you can expect decision makers to understand all of that detail. At some point, they have to take it on trust.
Perhaps I could add briefly to that, Victoria, just very quick. So I think some of this as well is the learning between as a scientist and the stakeholders, because there is sometimes this belief that you can we've got so much land in the UK that we can meet all of the targets that are set in policy. And actually, when you actually try and model it and you present that to a decision maker, they'd sort of think, oh, hang on, so we can't do that. So if we try and not export our environmental footprint elsewhere, we've got to do things within our own space, which means that there's lots more tough decisions that I've got to make and potential trade-offs that are sort of policy or societal decisions. So I think there's an iterative loop that modelling can, and I wouldn't say that's exactly non-intuitive, but it's a learning process more than anything, and it's iterative over time as we start to understand some of the interdependencies and both across sort of human and policy decision making and across sort of the environmental constraints that takes place within.
Thank you, Paula. I have a question from Paul Sweeney, who was raising his hand. Paul, please.
It's a question for Paula. You didn't mention parameterization. We went through a very big exercise many years ago looking at trying to evaluate groundwater models, and we gave the same data and the same models to different modelers, and actually the differences between the modelers was greater than the difference between the models. And particularly when you're coupling models which you may not understand yourself very well, how you will interpret the data to parameterize those models is absolutely critical. You really do need very clear guidelines, not only on what the models are doing, but how they should be parameterized and also how to interpret the results. It's an absolutely critical part of that process.
Yeah, so I can completely agree. So yeah, I didn't go a lot into parameterization, calibration and validation, and that was discussed quite extensively in the workshop, to be fair. Maybe we just should have pushed it more into our slides. But yeah, I agree, it's so important, and it's all down to this building the relationship and the communication between the modelers themselves, so they actually understand their models and how they're parameterized. But also I think part of it, again, we've done this in participatory process where we've, particularly if your change model is then classified as business critical by a stakeholder, so you know they're going to use it to inform decisions, not make the decisions for them, but inform them, then we've asked for joint parameterization and sign off of parameterizations by stakeholders so that they learn with us, and we're all happy with the parameterizations that we learn, knowing that there's never a perfect answer, but we're willing to go with a parameterization that we think best fits the decision context.
That's a wise move, I think.
So maybe one last question before we really wrap this up. So there's one question from Alex Sagan-Zanker, and I think it can probably answered by all of you, three of you. Can models help in other aspects of decision making beyond making a choice? So for instance, deciding which problems, alternatives, and criteria should be considered.
Shall I take that one to start with?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I think they can. There's a lot of work you can do exploring things in models. In fact, in some ways, they're better suited to exploration than they are to making firm predictions, because the fact that they're not quite right doesn't matter so much, because you're not expecting them to be right. You're expecting to explore what happens if I do this. Multiple uses in this sort of things beyond simple decision making, as in what subsidy do I put on farming, or how many acres of trees I plant. There's lots of balancing you can do with models in that way.
Yeah, I would also support that. I think the exploratory mode of, I mean, certainly in coupled modelling, I think they should be used in an exploratory way, as it's a way of actually understanding the system and actually whether you intuitively think of the system in that way. And people think of systems in different ways. So I think it's just a really, really interesting way of actually trying to get people to understand what's essentially a complex system. And actually just understanding that, just improving that understanding can help decisions, but without actually being specific about what that decision has to be. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we'll just stop it at this stage because we're already overrunning our time. So there are some comments still on Slido, so I would invite maybe you speakers just to take a look at it. Maybe you want to look into them individually. Most of them are just comments, not so much like really questions. But I think that was quite an interesting start to our workshop, and it seems like there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of interest in all this, and so I'm looking forward to the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Maybe we should just let people know that tomorrow we've got stakeholder presentations, so it'd be interesting for them to actually understand a bit more about the needs from landscape models that we can then, before we move on to sort of more of the science presentations later in the week.
That's right. Thank you very much. Felix, you
I
have
was
to
just going to say, I think there's a comment on Slido about whether we're going to provide any feedback on the things that were funded from the landscape decisions call last week. And I think we have some talks, don't we, by some of the PIs of the bigger funded projects. So that those are in the afternoon tomorrow. So just as a quick comment on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, and then we'll see you all back tomorrow again.
Okay. Thanks everyone. Bye. Bye.